Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Claudia Valeggia, who is a biological anthropologist at Yale. She studies the interactions between human reproductive biology and the ecological and cultural context in which it develops. Her research interests include human reproductive ecology, reproductive endocrinology, maternal and child health, evolutionary demography, and biodemography of aging. Today we'll talk with Professor Valeggia about the health of indigenous peoples. Welcome, Professor Valeggia.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so you have a paper that you co-authored with Josh Snodgrass that is in the annual review of anthropology, where you're looking at indigenous populations worldwide. So let's talk about that a little bit. Give us an overview of the paper.
The paper came out a couple of years ago, and it's an overview of the situation of the health and well-being of indigenous people across the globe. Okay.
And are you looking in particular countries?
Not particular. In this, we attempted to do a global overview, although my experience is with the Americas.
Okay. So go ahead.
And it is an important line of research. Both Josh and I have been working with indigenous populations for the last 20 years and wanted to bring to the front the predicament of indigenous peoples nowadays and the challenges they face economically, socially, politically, emotionally as they transition to different lifestyles and how that has an impact on their health.
Okay, let's define the term indigenous because I know there's some politics around that term.
Of course, yeah, the term indigenous is loaded, as you may imagine, socially and politically, so we cannot really talk of a definition. There's always going to be criticism based on different perspectives. For our papers, we used one that refers to certain criteria for defining the groups that have lived in a particular geographical area over a long period of time, pre-colonization and pre-invasion from other societies, and that had a continuity over time in that region. So that is more a criterial definition. Okay. There are also referential or relational definitions that put the group, the population, in relation to other groups in that geographical area. And those are good definitions too. They serve other purposes, and many times they're more nuanced because they highlight the relationship between the indigenous group and hegemonic powers or other socio-political powers with which they interact.
Okay, so let's talk about specific indigenous peoples that you did look at.
Yes, so I've been working for the last 20 years with the COM of Argentina, and I'm going to make an aside because in the literature you will find that they're called Toba, T-O-B-A. Okay. But for the last 5-6 years, there is a strong movement towards changing their name to COM, which is the name they refer to themselves, right? Okay. These our people. Toba was a term that other indigenous people used to refer to them, and in Guarani, this language, it means big forehead, because they had a cultural practice of shaving the first few centimeters of their hair, so they looked like they had big foreheads. Okay. So these people inhabit the Gran Chaco area of South America, which is northern Argentina, southern Paraguay, a little bit of Brazil, a little bit of Bolivia, and originally hunter-gatherers have been one of the last indigenous populations in Argentina to be settled and colonized. And I also work with the Huichi, which is a different linguistic family from the Com, but who share the same territory, the Gran Chaco.
Okay, any other outside of the South America?
Outside of South America, I've been working with Cachiquel and Tutuhil Maya people of Guatemala.
Okay. So in terms of your paper, what are some of the changes that are significantly impacting the indigenous peoples of the places that you've looked at?
Across the world, what you see is a process of westernization, or in some cases globalization. So changes, important changes in their lifestyle that comes from encroachment of settlers from different parts of the country where they live, to frank colonization. And this may have happened a couple of centuries ago, or very recently, like some Amazonian populations who are still not, they have been contacted, they have been interacting somehow with the Western world, but they're still living in their traditional lifestyle. So we see a spectrum of transitions. The most important ones, I think, are subsistence patterns. Indigenous populations generally are either hunter-gatherers or herders, pastoralists, or foragers in general, and now, and with some nomadism, some changing in their settling patterns. So now they become settled, they change their diet, they change their physical activity patterns, there's a loss of land and cultural continuity, so that has a definite impact on their health.
Okay, so what about in the cultures that you've looked at, or the people that you've looked at, let's talk about some of the health challenges that they're facing and why.
Right. In general, from Siberia to the equator, what you see is that one of the most important health challenges is to cope with infectious disease. So that's still pretty much the main source of mortality. Gastrointestinal infections with parasites and other pathogens, respiratory infections still take a big toll on their lives. But now, as they become more westernized in their lifestyle, other diseases are starting to really be a problem for them. Like
such as what?
Cardiovascular disease, for example, and diseases related to overweight and obesity that are affecting both developing and developed countries, right? We used to call them diseases of affluence because they come with attached to an overflow of calories and little physical activity, but now it's widespread, and you see that.
So while they're getting the diseases of the Western world, they're not necessarily getting the medical attention that the Western world has? Exactly.
So there are several barriers. There are still a lot of consequences of colonization processes, oppression and violence that have an impact on their access to public health services, for example, and they are available in the countries where they live. There are barriers that come with being discriminated against by the hegemonic powers, or physical barriers. Some of these populations live isolated in the middle of the forest or in the Siberian steppes, so there are physical obstacles to reach to free healthcare services, for example. But once they get there, they maybe get discriminated. Language is another barrier. Most indigenous people still have their native language as the main way of communication. So there is frustration on both parts, the healthcare providers and the recipients not being able to communicate their needs and concerns.
In terms of, I'm curious, because you did mention that some of them are very based in very remote areas. How does the Western world, I'll call it the Western world, get to the remote location? And are they excited by the prospects of what the Western world brings, or are they, you know, or are they hesitant to embrace?
That's a very good question. There's a lot of variation.
Okay.
There is a set of populations that are proactively seeking the contact and the immersion in the more westernized world, and others are completely reluctant and do not want to get contacted. As they become more and more isolated, there is a lot of pressure for them, because if they get sick, or as their territory gets smaller and smaller, they need to look for resources which are outside of their traditional land, and that brings conflict. So for them, it's a push-pull situation with that.
So what are some of your findings in the paper?
In the paper, we have a set of challenges that have to do with nutrition, that have to do with cardiovascular disease. Some important and neglected areas have to do with mental health and psycho-emotional well-being. I'm particularly worried about that because we have not paid a lot of attention to that. We started exploring more systematically that among the COM, and one of the main difficulties is trying to understand their own mental health construct, because maybe we are applying a depression scale that works very well in our society, but it doesn't register with them.
Right.
So we need to start a dialogue and see that there are other ways of knowing, other ways of coping, and they may be different concerns for them that affect their mental health.
Okay.
Indigenous people have one of the highest rates of what we Westerns would consider depression, anxiety, suicide rates, substance abuse, all reflective of this imbalance in their well-being that, in a sense, we brought to them, because they I always use the phrase, they lost their GPS socially. They need to relearn the codes, and that is difficult.
Right. Especially anytime there's great change, it is easy to lose your moorings. So I think one of the things that has been happening over the last decade is, and you note this in your paper, there are more global health initiatives being instituted across universities, you know, basically in the north. And so let's talk a little bit about, you know, your findings around that.
Right. So we have these global health initiatives all the way from big institutions like WHO down to universities in the north, for example. I think every major university here in the United States has a global health initiative program that whose goal is to expose students to other realities in terms of health and illness, which are very good and well-intended goals, but there are certain issues that have to be adjusted when it's taken to most of them developing countries.
Such as what?
My take is that sometimes we are reproducing colonial ways.
In what way?
We are sending students to this developing country setting to get trained in global health. So that is basically colonial perspective. I'm not saying that every single one has, but it's something that I urge global health programs to be aware of and to do some self-reflection in the kind of attitude students go to. There is the typical savior syndrome, right?
Sure.
I know what it takes to
help these people,
right? Where it's just the opposite. We are there to learn.
Right.
We are there to learn about other ways of knowing, other ways of health, illness, dichotomies, or the spectrum of health illness. So I am critical in that sense, that we need to be aware of the pitfalls of reproducing colonial plans.
Do you think there are any pros to having the Global Health Initiative?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I don't want to stress only the negative.
Right.
Of course, the first thing that comes to mind is resources. We can provide the material resources, the logistical resources, and some of the administrative resources that sometimes are lacking in those settings.
Right.
So we provide that capital in a sense, but we need to partner with the local administrators and the local people, the indigenous people, to make this work.
Do you think that by having the global health initiatives and other services go into these communities, that they're basically helping to erode the indigenous peoples around the world, basically? By having this influence come in, it's really changing the dynamics and they're not going to be indigenous any longer. What are your thoughts about that?
That's a great question. I think there's a little bit of both, in that sense that, yes, we are exporting our ways of dealing with health and dealing with disease that may be completely different from the indigenous people's ways of doing it. So now the indigenous people are found in this situation where they have to choose with which therapeutic itinerary they will take, and many times that causes conflict. Among the COM, for example, when a child is sick, the mother looks at the general appearance of the child and decides whether this is a white disease or it is something that has to do with witchcraft. So she decides which therapeutic route to go, and which is in itself very interesting. And I think those are the things that the Western public health system need to understand in order to be more effective and really work with the community.
Do you ever find yourself in a situation when you're in the field, particularly around a health concern, and perhaps this hasn't happened to you, but I am just curious since you're talking about health, where you come across a situation where the person can definitely benefit from Western medicine, but they're not going that route?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yes. So how do you deal with that?
With a lot of doubt. Many times during my years working with the COM, I found myself in suspended belief and say, well, I'm not going to bring my own way of thinking here because I need to listen to, and have a very particular case, an anecdote to tell you. So I became very good friends with Betty. Betty is a 47-year-old woman with 4 children. Our worlds cannot be more apart. But somehow there was a connection. And we became friends. One day, after, it was during the summer, one of my trips there, I find that she's very sick. So she says, I'm not sure what this is, and say, Betty, please come to the hospital with me. So I take her to the hospital. She goes straight into the ICU. So her state was quite delicate. 2 days into the IUC, so they look at her and say, we don't know what she has. Everything seems to be out of balance. We cannot find a cause. So I go to her and say, Betty, what do you think? What's going on? I say, well, yeah, this is not a white disease. Take me out of here. I'm going to die tomorrow if you don't. And say, but here you are well taken care of. All your needs are covered. I'm going to die tomorrow, Claudia. Just take me out. So I had to talk to the Western doctors and say, I'm taking her out. And they say, well, you have to sign responsibility because this is not medically advised. And it was quite a moment for me to take a decision and say, well, I have to just let go of my Western training and trust that she knows. And I did. The following day, she was up and walking.
Really?
Yes.
So why? Can you say why?
Again, I suspended my belief. My post hoc interpretation is that there is a big impact of feeling I am the target of witchcraft, which raises cortisol levels, which raises a lot of psycho-emotional stress that may affect certain parts of your body. But that's...
So did Betty believe she was a target of witchcraft?
Oh, absolutely. She said, I'm going to go to my doctor. And she did. The following week, she came with little stones the shaman took out of her lungs to prove, yeah, you were the target of witchcraft.
She took stones out of her lungs?
Yes.
How does that even happen?
I don't know, because I've never witnessed. Last summer, I was very close to, because they invited me to go, and I felt, do I belong here? I don't want to intrude and say, no, no, no. We want you to see it because we want you to know
believe
that this is right, that this is real.
Right.
And then the encounter never happened. So maybe next summer.
Well, I think, yes, if you get another opportunity,
yes.
I think that would
absolutely.
be just an amazing thing to be a part of if they
so
allowed it.
So that teaches us that we Westerners are not the ones with the truth for everything, right? So there are other ways of
there certainly are
dealing with disease.
Okay, so what do you conclude in the paper?
I conclude in the paper just giving a little bit of praise to anthropologists because I think we are in an ideal position to collaborate in global health initiatives and in trying to ameliorate the dire situation of indigenous peoples. We can act as brokers. We usually know the codes very well. We can translate the dialogue back and forth between the community and the healthcare providers to make it more real and not so top down.
Right, right. Do you see that happening in any of the communities that you've
Yes.
studied?
Yeah, I have colleagues that have made of this a career goal. The issue is that it's not incentivized because funding agencies do not fund your community-based research, applied research. So they are interested mostly in the science, in the epidemiology of that, but doing this brokerage is not compensated. So that puts barriers in what you can do.
How would one advocate for that to become a part of the process?
I think by lobbying with funding agencies like NIH, NSF, saying this is important, this is broader impacts. I think NSF is really paying attention to the broader impacts of research, not just the science of it. And I think as a faculty, my duty, part of my responsibility is to train my students in having both a basic science and an applied component in their research, and training them to become part of the community in the sense of you have the privilege, you have a voice, just use it on behalf of the indigenous people you are working with.
Okay, so what are you working on now?
Now we are working on a long-term project that looks at 3 transitions. Babies that are transitioning from being exclusively breastfed to being on the adult diet, the puberty transition in girls, and the perimenopausal transition in women. So we are looking at physical changes, hormonal changes, but also social and cultural changes across those 3 periods and transitions, and trying to understand how they talk to each other, how things get under the skin, and if we can learn from that interaction. All
right, well, we will look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss my research.
You are welcome. Okay. For more information about Professor Valeggia and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. so much.
Thank you.